Have you heard about the story of Lot's daughters getting their dad drunk? Yeah, it's a shocking tale full of mysteries. Today, we're going to understand this intriguing account from the Bible. We'll dive into the reasons behind their actions, the impact it had over the years, and what we can learn from it all. So, if you're curious to find out what really happened in that cave and how it affected future generations, stick with me. It's going to be a journey full of surprises. The historical and cultural context of Sodom and Gomorrah. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is one of the most dramatic in the Bible. These cities were infamous for their wickedness, and their destruction was a direct consequence of their sinfulness. God decided to wipe them from the earth as a sign of his judgment. But what many people miss is the deep cultural and societal context that surrounded these cities. Understanding the world that Lot and his daughters lived in is key to grasping why the events unfolded as they did. Lot and his family were residents of Sodom, living in a city that was morally corrupt and beyond redemption. The intense immorality of the place wasn't just about personal choices but represented a deep-rooted culture of evil. In such a chaotic environment, escaping with their lives became the priority. But the destruction of the city left emotional scars on Lot's daughters, who saw not just the physical ruin but also the loss of their future and community. When Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, Lot's daughters believed they were witnessing the end of civilization as they knew it. In their minds, there were no other men left on earth. Their perception of reality was shaped by the trauma of witnessing divine judgment. This sense of finality was crucial in the decisions they would later make. The world Lot's daughters grew up in had a heavy emphasis on lineage. In ancient cultures, having descendants was vital, especially for women. Procreation wasn't just about continuing the family, it was seen as a duty. Without children, the future of Lot's family was doomed. The pressure on Lot's daughters to ensure their family's survival weighed heavily on them. Understanding the desperation, fear, and societal expectations that surrounded Lot's daughters helps us see their actions in a broader context. They didn't act out of malice but out of a misguided sense of duty and hopelessness. Lot and his daughters escaped to the mountains. When Lot, his wife, and daughters fled from Sodom, they left behind everything they had ever known. Fleeing from a city as it crumbled under divine judgment is an experience that would terrify anyone. Lot's family found refuge in the mountains, a place of safety, but also isolation. This isolation would play a key role in shaping their fateful decisions. The journey to the mountains was filled with loss. Lot's wife looked back at the burning city and was turned into a pillar of salt. Her disobedience served as a stark reminder of how seriously God viewed their escape. But for Lot's daughters, this moment represented the loss of their mother and any chance of returning to normal life. They were now alone with their father, unsure of what the future held. In the mountains, they were cut off from the rest of the world. No neighbors, no community, no prospects of finding husbands. The daughters believed they were the last people alive. The isolation deepened their sense of desperation. In their minds, repopulating the earth wasn't just an option, it was a necessity. This extreme isolation is what led Lot's daughters to make such a drastic choice. Without any external influences or options, they relied on their own limited understanding of survival. They believed that if they didn't act, humanity itself might vanish. It's important to understand that their actions weren't driven by selfishness, but by a deeply ingrained fear of extinction. Their decision to embriagar their father, Lot, was a direct result of their circumstances. They knew that he would never willingly participate in their plan, so they took matters into their own hands. This action was a result of the hopeless environment they found themselves in, not a reflection of their moral character. The destruction of Sodom, a new beginning or the end? The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was not just the end of two cities. For Lot's daughters, it felt like the end of the world. Imagine witnessing fire raining from the sky, reducing everything you've ever known to ashes. For them, the obliteration of Sodom signified the total destruction of society, leaving them with a bleak and uncertain future. After fleeing to the mountains, Lot's daughters saw themselves as the last women on earth. With no communication with the outside world, they truly believed they were alone. In their minds, the destruction of Sodom wasn't just about punishment, it was about starting over. But how could they start over without men to continue their lineage? This sense of finality shaped their decisions. The destruction they witnessed wasn't just physical, it was emotional and psychological. They had lost their homes, their mother, and any prospects for marriage or family. They felt like the last hope for the human race, and this overwhelming sense of responsibility clouded their judgment. They believed their only option was to take extreme measures to preserve their father's bloodline. The embriaguez of Lot wasn't something they wanted to happen, it was something they believed needed to happen. The destruction of Sodom had shattered their sense of right and wrong, replacing it with a singular focus: survival. In their eyes, the end of Sodom was both a new beginning and a catastrophe. It's important to understand that while their actions were shocking, they were driven by a deep sense of duty to preserve what little they had left. The influence of fear and insecurity on Lot's daughters' decisions. Fear can drive people to do things they never imagined. For Lot's daughters, fear of extinction and insecurity about their future clouded their moral compass. In their minds, they weren't just acting for themselves, they were acting for the survival of humanity. But it's important to understand how deeply fear and insecurity shaped their actions. After the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot's daughters were left without a community or the possibility of finding husbands. In their culture, women without children were considered failures. The fear of being left without descendants weighed heavily on them. This fear of becoming obsolete, of seeing their family line end, became the driving force behind their actions. They were also insecure about their place in the world. With the loss of their home, they lost their sense of identity and belonging. The mountains, while providing safety, also represented loneliness and isolation. This insecurity made them feel as if they had no future outside of the drastic actions they were considering. The embriaguez of their father was a desperate act born from these insecurities. They believed that if they didn't take action, their family's legacy would be lost forever. The decision to intoxicate Lot was driven by fear, not by malice or selfishness. It was an extreme solution to what they saw as an extreme problem. Their fear and insecurity may seem irrational to us now, but in their world, it made sense. They were living in a time where survival meant everything, and they were willing to do whatever it took to preserve their family line. It's important to view their actions through the lens of fear and desperation. The role of Lot's intoxication in the story. Lot, though a passive character in this part of the story, plays a crucial role in the events that transpired. His daughter's decision to embriagar him wasn't random, it was calculated. They knew that Lot would never willingly agree to their plan, so they took matters into their own hands, using his intoxication as a means to an end. In the Bible, intoxication often symbolizes a loss of control. For Lot, being drunk meant that he was unaware of what was happening around him. His daughters took advantage of this state to carry out their plan, believing it was the only way to ensure the survival of their family line. In a sense, Lot was both a victim and a participant, albeit unknowingly. The fact that Lot didn't know what was happening adds another layer of complexity to the story. It raises questions about consent, morality, and the lengths people will go to when faced with extreme situations. Lot's intoxication becomes a symbol of the chaos and desperation that followed the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's also worth noting that Lot's role as the father of both the Moabites and Ammonites carries significant weight in biblical history. These two nations, born from the union between Lot and his daughters, would later play important roles in the story of Israel. So, while Lot was unaware of his part in these events, the consequences of his intoxication would be felt for generations. Ultimately, Lot's intoxication serves as a reminder of how human weakness can lead to unforeseen consequences. It wasn't just about losing control for one night, it was about setting the stage for the birth of nations. The role of women and procreation in ancient society. In ancient cultures, a woman's value was often tied to her ability to bear children. Without offspring, a woman's role in society was diminished, and her family line risked extinction. For Lot's daughters, the pressure to procreate wasn't just personal, it was societal. They believed that their only purpose was to ensure the survival of their family. In a world where lineage was everything, the idea of not having children was unthinkable. Women were seen as the bearers of future generations, and without them, a family's legacy would be lost. This cultural expectation played a significant role in shaping the decisions of Lot's daughters. Their actions, while shocking, can be understood within the context of this pressure to continue the family line. They weren't acting out of selfishness, they were acting out of a sense of duty to their father and their heritage. In their minds, the only way to preserve their family was through procreation, no matter the means. The story of Lot's daughters also highlights the limited agency that women had in ancient society. Without husbands, they had no way of securing their future. The destruction of Sodom left them without options, forcing them to take extreme measures to ensure their survival. Their decision was a reflection of the harsh realities women faced in ancient times. Ultimately, the actions of Lot's daughters remind us of the immense pressure that society can place on individuals, especially women. Their story is a tragic example of how cultural expectations and fear of extinction can lead to desperate choices. The ethical dilemma, right or wrong. The story of Lot and his daughters is filled with moral complexity. At first glance, their actions seem shocking and indefensible, but when we consider the context, it becomes clear that they were grappling with an ethical dilemma. The key question remains, were their actions right or wrong, or were they simply doing the best they could under extreme circumstances? Lot's daughters believed they had no choice. In their minds, they were acting to save their family's future. To them, the destruction of Sodom signaled the end of the world. They felt an overwhelming responsibility to preserve their father's lineage, a task that society had ingrained in them as women. From this perspective, they weren't acting out of selfishness or malice but rather a misguided sense of duty. On the other hand, the idea of embriagando their father and forcing him into an unconscious act raises serious ethical questions. Their actions were deceptive and manipulative, violating the very trust that should exist within a family. No matter the reasoning, there's an undeniable moral conflict here that can't be ignored. The Bible often presents stories that challenge our understanding of morality, and this is one of them. Lot's daughters faced a situation where there were no easy answers, and their actions serve as a reminder that sometimes, people make desperate choices when faced with impossible circumstances. The ethical question of right or wrong remains open for interpretation. Ultimately, this story invites us to reflect on the complexities of human nature. People aren't always purely good or evil, sometimes they are just trying to survive in a world that feels broken beyond repair. The legacy of Moab and Ammon, nations born from desperation. The descendants of Lot's daughters didn't fade into obscurity. In fact, their actions led to the birth of two significant nations, the Moabites and the Ammonites. These nations would go on to play important roles in the biblical narrative, often in conflict with the Israelites. Understanding the origin of these nations helps us appreciate the lasting consequences of Lot's daughters' decisions. The Moabites, born from Lot's older daughter, and the Ammonites, born from the younger daughter, both traced their lineage back to Abraham's family. Despite their complicated beginnings, these nations became powerful and influential in their own right. Their existence shows how even morally complex decisions can have far-reaching impacts. However, the relationship between these nations and Israel was fraught with tension. The Moabites and Ammonites were often enemies of Israel, and their history is marked by wars, alliances, and conflicts. This turbulent relationship can be traced back to their origins, where desperation led to the creation of new peoples, whose destinies would be intertwined with Israel. It's fascinating to think that a moment of fear and desperation could lead to the birth of entire nations. The story of Moab and Ammon serves as a reminder that even actions made in the shadows of uncertainty can leave a lasting legacy. In the end, the story of these nations is a powerful example of how decisions, even those made under extreme circumstances, can shape the course of history. Lot's daughters may have been acting out of fear, but their actions would have consequences that rippled through generations. The psychological impact of trauma on decision-making. To fully understand why Lot's daughters acted the way they did, we must consider the psychological toll of trauma. Witnessing the destruction of their city, losing their mother, and fleeing to the mountains would have caused immense emotional and mental strain. Trauma affects decision-making in profound ways, often leading people to act out of fear, desperation, or confusion. For Lot's daughters, the trauma of Sodom's destruction was overwhelming. They had watched their entire world burn, and their minds were filled with the fear that they might be the last survivors on Earth. In such a traumatic state, their thinking became skewed, and the normal boundaries of morality and reason began to blur. Psychologically, trauma can make people feel isolated and hopeless. Lot's daughters were cut off from society and had no way of knowing if there were other people left. This isolation only magnified their fears, making them feel as though the responsibility to save their family rested solely on their shoulders. In such a state, it's easy to understand why they made such drastic decisions. Trauma can also cause people to become fixated on certain ideas, like the need to preserve their family line. In their minds, ensuring that their father had descendants became an obsession, a way to regain control in an uncontrollable situation. This fixation, driven by trauma, led them to act in ways they otherwise wouldn't have. In conclusion, the story of Lot's daughters is a powerful illustration of how trauma can distort thinking and push people into making choices they never imagined. Their actions were not just a product of fear, but of the deep psychological wounds left by the destruction of their world. God's judgment and mercy in the story of Lot. One of the key themes in the story of Lot is the balance between God's judgment and his mercy. Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed because of their wickedness, but God showed mercy to Lot by allowing him and his daughters to escape. Yet, even within this mercy, there were still consequences for the choices made by Lot and his family. God's judgment on Sodom was swift and severe, wiping out an entire city due to its unrepentant sin. But in the midst of this destruction, God remembered Lot. He spared him, not because of Lot's righteousness, but because of God's mercy. This act of deliverance shows that even in the midst of judgment, God's grace is present for those he chooses to save. However, mercy doesn't erase the consequences of sin and human choices. Lot's daughters, though spared from Sodom's destruction, were left to face the repercussions of their own decisions. The birth of the Moabites and Ammonites came with its own challenges, as these nations would later oppose Israel, God's chosen people. The story serves as a reminder that even when God offers mercy, the consequences of our actions remain. God's mercy is also seen in how he allows Lot and his daughters to continue living, despite their questionable choices. Their survival is a testament to God's grace, which sometimes extends even when people act out of fear and desperation. God doesn't abandon them, but he does allow the natural consequences of their actions to unfold. In the end, the story of Lot and his daughters is a complex one, where God's judgment and mercy intersect. It shows that while God is just, he is also compassionate, providing a way out even in the darkest of situations. The role of alcohol in the story of Lot and his daughters. Alcohol plays a significant role in the story of Lot and his daughters, as it is the tool they use to manipulate their father into unknowingly participating in their plan. This raises questions about the dangers of alcohol and how it can be used to lower inhibitions, leading people to act in ways they might not otherwise. In ancient times, alcohol was a common part of daily life, but its effects were well known. Lot's daughters understood that getting their father drunk would impair his judgment, making him unaware of their actions. Their use of alcohol was calculated, and it shows how substances can be used to exploit or manipulate others when they're in a vulnerable state. This element of the story speaks to broader themes of control and power dynamics within families. The daughters used alcohol not just as a means to an end, but as a way to assert control over their father. In their minds, this was necessary to achieve their goal of preserving their family, but it also highlights the lengths people can go to when they feel powerless. Today, the story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of alcohol abuse and how it can lead to situations of vulnerability and exploitation. It reminds us that, even in ancient times, people were aware of the powerful effects of alcohol and how it could be misused. Ultimately, the use of alcohol in this story isn't just a plot device, it represents the blurred lines between intention and action, and the ways in which substances can complicate human behavior and decision-making. The story encourages reflection on how we use or misuse tools like alcohol in our own lives. The role of shame and secrecy in the aftermath. After the birth of Moab and Ammon, the story of Lot's daughters largely disappears from the biblical narrative. This raises questions about the role of shame and secrecy in their lives after the events in the cave. Did they live with the burden of their actions, or did they justify them as a means of survival? In many cultures, acts of incest carry a significant amount of shame. The Bible itself doesn't dwell on the emotional or psychological impact this may have had on Lot and his daughters, but we can imagine that the weight of their choices lingered with them. The secrecy of their actions, doing it in the isolation of the cave, implies a sense of shame even as they justified their behavior. Shame can often lead to silence, and this may be why we don't hear much more about Lot's daughters after this event. It's possible that their story continued quietly, away from the public eye, as they tried to move on from what had happened. The fact that they gave birth to nations suggests that their actions weren't widely condemned, but the personal toll of such a decision may have been heavy. This silence around their story speaks to a broader theme in human experience, the way shame can isolate us and keep us from processing or speaking openly about our actions. Their story invites us to consider how we deal with our own feelings of guilt or shame, and whether we face them head-on or let them fester in secrecy. In the end, the story of Lot's daughters is not just about what happened in the cave, it's also about the emotional and psychological aftermath. Their silence may speak louder than words, showing the burden they carried with them. What the story teaches about the human condition. At its core, the story of Lot and his daughters is about survival in a world turned upside down. It's a story that reflects the extremes people are willing to go to when they feel desperate, alone, and out of options. In this way, it serves as a powerful commentary on the human condition. Lot's daughters acted out of a deep fear that they would be the last people on earth. This fear drove them to make decisions that most people would find unthinkable. Yet, in their minds, it was a choice between extinction and survival. This highlights one of the most fundamental aspects of the human experience, the desire to continue, to live, even in the most difficult circumstances. The story also teaches us about the complexity of human motivation. Lot's daughters weren't acting out of malice or selfishness, they were trying to protect their family. Yet, their actions raise serious moral and ethical questions. This duality, acting with good intentions but causing harm, reflects the complexity of human nature. In many ways, the story of Lot and his daughters challenges us to look at our own lives and the difficult choices we face. It reminds us that people are capable of making extreme decisions when pushed to their limits, and that these decisions are often a mix of fear, love, and survival instincts. Ultimately, this story is a reflection of the human condition in all its complexity. It shows that people are neither purely good nor purely evil but are often navigating difficult, gray areas where the line between right and wrong is blurred. The cultural expectations of women in ancient times. One of the reasons Lot's daughters felt compelled to act as they did was because of the cultural expectations placed on women in ancient times. Women were expected to bear children and continue the family line. Without husbands or children, their status and future were uncertain, and this cultural pressure played a significant role in their decision-making. In the ancient world, women's value was often tied to their ability to have children. For Lot's daughters, the destruction of Sodom meant that there were no men left to marry them, leaving them with no clear path to fulfill their societal role. This cultural pressure to reproduce likely influenced their extreme actions. The story also reflects the limited choices available to women in ancient societies. Without husbands, they were powerless and vulnerable. Their decision to take matters into their own hands was an act of desperation, but it also shows how societal expectations can lead people to make drastic choices when they feel there is no other option. Today, the story of Lo's daughters serves as a reminder of the long-standing pressures that women have faced throughout history. While the circumstances may have changed, the underlying issues of gender expectations and societal pressure continue to shape the lives of women today. By examining the cultural context of this story, we gain a deeper understanding of why Lo's daughters acted as they did. It wasn't just about survival, it was also about meeting the expectations that society had placed upon them. The importance of context in biblical stories. The story of Lo and his daughters is one that demands careful consideration of its context. Without understanding the cultural, psychological, and historical factors at play, it's easy to misinterpret or oversimplify their actions. This story reminds us of the importance of considering context when interpreting any biblical narrative. In ancient times, survival was often a precarious thing, and the destruction of entire cities, like Sodom, was not uncommon. For Lo's daughters, the destruction of their home must have felt like the end of the world. Understanding this historical context helps us appreciate the extreme fear and desperation they must have felt. Moreover, the cultural context, where women's primary role was to bear children and continue the family line, plays a key role in understanding their motivations. Without husbands or any hope of marriage, they saw their actions as a way to fulfill the duty expected of them. Psychologically, the trauma of losing their home, their mother, and their community would have deeply affected Lo's daughters. The isolation they experienced in the cave only heightened their fear and distorted their decision-making. This story, like many in the Bible, is complex and layered. It challenges us to look beyond the surface and consider the broader context in which these events took place. By doing so, we can gain a deeper understanding of the motivations and pressures that shape the actions of biblical figures. Ultimately, the story of Lo's daughters teaches us the importance of viewing biblical stories with nuance and empathy, taking into account the many factors that influence human behavior. I hope this story made you think as much as it made me. The Bible is filled with complex and fascinating accounts like this one, each teaching us deep lessons about life, morality, and the choices we make. If you enjoyed this video and want to keep understanding surprising biblical themes with me, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel.